So I'm going to give you several examples of the roots, the historical roots of alienation. David Levy is one in the 1940s. Here's one from the 1960s. This is a psychiatrist named Murray Bowen, who had a theory of family relationships, and he introduced the idea of triangulation. And this is a little example of triangulation. We don't need to go into the details, but there's conflict in this family between dad and mom, and the child connects with one parent and has discord with the other parent. And this is Murray Bowen's idea that he published in the 1960s. I actually knew this guy a little bit. I used to work in a hospital that was next door to his clinic. And so sometimes I would go over and listen to what he had to say. So he's an example of somebody in the history of family therapy from the 1960s. And like I said, his concept was called triangulation. In fact, if you just look at part of this quote, there's a pattern in which the mother, in an over-adequate position to the child, has the so-called custody of the child, while the father is left out. So that's another person who's describing this phenomenon before the name parental alienation was ever known to anybody. So here's another person in the history of this concept named Salvador Minuchin, and he was published mainly in the 1970s. I'm going, chronologically as much as I can here. And Minuchin also had a concept that we know about today, which was cross-generational coalition. And in what he says, one of the parents joins the child in a cross-generational coalition against the other parent. So these people don't just exist in the abstract. Salvador Minuchin is actually the mentor of people in this room. There are people here who knew him and were tutored by him. And so these historical figures have percolated down to our own face-to-face understanding of parental alienation. I'm trying to give you a historical diversity, okay? And what, in case it isn't obvious, what I'm trying to show you is that even though Richard Gardner was really important in the history of this concept, that he isn't the only person. In other words, it's really fallacious to criticize parental alienation by saying Richard Gardner was off base and didn't know what he was talking about, because it doesn't just come from him. It is true that the phrase parental alienation syndrome was invented, in a sense, by Gardner, and this was his really famous article published in 1985 in which he introduced that term. But I guess what I'm trying to convey is that our history is not just from Gardner, it's from a number of different sources. And this is Gardner's official definition of the syndrome: a disturbance in which children are obsessed with deprecation and criticism of a parent, denigration that is unjustified or exaggerated. So I think we're all kind of familiar with that phrase. And of course, we still live with that phrase today. But he's just one of many ancestors to our current situation. There's another really important ancestor, which are Stanley Flower and Bryn Brivlin, who are a sociologist and a social worker who wrote these books. Children Held Hostage. This is the original edition, and then this was the edition a few years ago, the second edition. So just let me give you an example of what they said. Yeah, they're the people who use the phrases programming and brainwashing, and they had definitions of programming and they had definitions of brainwashing, and they had many, many examples. They had a study that involved 1,000 children from maybe 800 families over the years, in which they developed many, many examples of alienating behaviors and symptoms in the children. And their work was about the same time as Gardner's work. And eventually they got to know each other. And in their work, they do refer to Gardner. But these books that they did were very important Do you remember what they were? Right here. They're very important. Do you know why? Because these books were promoted or commissioned, I guess is the word, by a component of the American Bar Association. These books didn't just show up, but the family law section of the American Bar Association contacted Clower and Rivlin and asked them to publish this study. So this is a huge study that was commissioned and endorsed, as much as you can say, by the American Bar Association. That's really important.